Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the very first installment of Missouri Prairie Foundation's Prairie webinar series. My name is Felicia Ammon. I am the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation. For our first talk in this series, we will be hearing from Bruce Schuette, MPF's Vice President of Science and Management, on the conservation significance of Missouri's prairies. Bruce Schuette retired in 2014 from working 36 years as a park naturalist at Quiver River State Park, where he was involved in natural resource management, natural resource inventory, collections, monitoring, working with researchers, and nature education. He has served on the MPF board since January of 2000, served as secretary 2005 to 2012, and of course is vice president of science and management, and also the chairman of the Science and Management Committee. He has a bachelor's degree in wildlife management from the University of Missouri-Columbia. So be sure to check out the rest of the webinar series that runs on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. through the end of May. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bruce. Hang on just a second. All right, take it away, Bruce.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I'd like to welcome you as we talk about the conservation significance of Missouri prairie remnants today, especially those or with examples from the Missouri Prairie Foundation's Prairies. This certainly feels different. I've done lots and lots of PowerPoint talks before, but I've never done one talking into the computer, and I've never done one sitting on my couch in my living room. So this does certainly feel quite a bit different, but hopefully it will all work, and we'll go ahead and get started. So this is a map that shows the extent of original prairie in Missouri. This one was a map done by Walter Schrader, and so you can see how extensive prairies were. But this is a map of our grasslands today. So as you can see, there's still a lot of grasslands in Missouri. The problem is a lot of these grasslands, the vast majority of them, are very poor quality for native fauna and for native flora.
Hey, Bruce, real quick. This is Felicia. Yes. I don't think your screen is showing. Can you hit that screen share button? It's the green button at the bottom, I believe.
Okay. I'm not seeing a green button.
It would be the screen share button.
Okay. I'm not seeing any screen share button at all. Any of the screen share stuff is not.
Hang on just a second. Let's see. Hold tight, everybody.
So the screen is not showing at all?
No, we have someone who just said if you hover your mouse over the edge or over the bottom of the screen, you might be able to find it.
Over the mouse? I don't see anything.
It might be over the top of the screen.
None of the Zoom features seem to be showing up. Oh, let's see. Okay. Does that help?
Not quite.
Did that do anything? Okay.
Or look on the edge of the window. Oh,
Okay.
here we go. I think it's going. All right, now just hit slideshow to start from the beginning.
Okay, that better?
Yes, there we go. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for your help in the chat.
But remember, this is the first one in the series. So here's the pre-settlement map of Missouri's prairies. And so you can see there's a lot of grasslands in Missouri's landscape, but most of it now is introduced exotic grasses and just is very poor quality for wildlife and native flora. What you can see are some little red flecks down in parts of, especially the southwestern part of the state. And these are the remnant prairies that are known to still exist in Missouri. So lots of grasslands, but very, very little prairie. If we go down to southwestern Missouri, where most of the existing prairies are, same thing. This is what was here originally. That's the grasslands that are here now, with, again, most of the state's remnant prairies. They're the little blotches of red. So there are a lot of grasslands in Missouri, but very few prairies. This shows the holdings of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, including their size and how much of them are those acres actual remnant prairie. So you can see over half of the Prairie Foundation's holdings are remnant prairies. Now, thinking about conservation, of course, a good thing to remember are the words of Aldo Leopold. One of Aldo Leopold's favorite quotes of mine is that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity and stability and beauty of the biotic community, and wrong when it tends to do otherwise. Another one of his quotes that I really like is that to keep the cog and wheel is a first precaution of intelligent tinkering, which to me, this really sums up the importance of protecting, especially our rarer species and all the species that are part of our native biological diversity. It just shows how important they are that we keep all those pieces. So to me, the idea of conservation significance is really protecting and managing for those elements of the ecosystems, and especially those that you might say are the most irreplaceable. We want to have all the elements around, but what are the most irreplaceable? And if we lose them from a particular site, basically they're gone from the landscape. They're not going to be coming back because they're not part of roadside systems or old fields. So if we lose those at a remnant prairie, for example, we've pretty much lost it from the area. This is keeping all the cogs and all the wheels. And so how do we know we have, you might say, good prairies? At this time, of course, the remnant landscape is very fragmented with just small scattered pieces, and we have very limited budgets. You can ask Carol David, who works extremely hard to try and make sure that we have funding to try to protect some of these remnants. But because funding is so limited, we want to try and make sure we're doing the best, most responsible job of protecting the places with the most significance. So how do we know what these sites are? Well, first of all, it's important to have places with undisturbed, or at least as relatively undisturbed as we have in today's landscapes, those undisturbed soils. This was from the Missouri Prairie Journal in the fall and winter of 2015 in an article by Bob Kramer and Kristen Wiem about the fact that a diverse vegetation found on our native prairie landscapes is the most diverse that we know of any terrestrial ecosystem on Earth. And to give you just an idea, they have shown that in just 1 gram of prairie soil, so if you take a pound of prairie soil, divide that into 16ths, you divide one of those 16ths into 28ths, and in one of those 28ths of a 16th of a pound, you can find these incredible numbers of bacteria and fungi and protists and algae, most of which, vast majority of which, aren't even currently known. We just know that they're in there. So with all these unknowns and the prospective value that they contain, it's crucially important that we maintain these undisturbed prairie soils. So that's of great conservation significance. Now, also, as we go through and flora and fauna, we have to realize that there are both grassland species and prairie specialist species. So of many species that are found in prairies, they're not needing a high quality remnant natural prairie community. They just need basically a grassland system, the structure of a grassland system. And so we have more generalist grassland species. And then we have a series of species, kind of a subset of the overall grassland species that are really restricted to that high quality, floristically diverse remnant prairie, basically an old growth remnant prairie natural community. And these are species that are restricted to that. So again, you can see in our broad look at Missouri, there is a lot of habitat out there, even though much of this is not real suitable. Some of it is, but there's a lot more habitat potentially for grassland species than there are for those prairie specialist species that are restricted to just the little red dots that are there in mostly in southwestern portion of the state. And so a good way to look at the plants that define a prairie community is, or it comes from Doug Glad and Justin Thomas in 2015 in an article they wrote, an ecological checklist of the Missouri flora for floristic quality assessment. And in it, they mention that native species respond differently to changes and alteration in the landscape. Some species can tolerate significant impacts and other species can't. They're restricted to sites that are characterized by post-glacial pre-European landscape. Now, this is something that probably all of us kind of feel, but Ladd and Thomas were able to somewhat quantify it by giving all of our native species a ranking between 0 and 10 of the fidelity of that species to a native landscape. So basically, in kind of using this to kind of go through it quickly, species with 4 scores, 0 for ragweed, 1 for black-eyed Susan, 2 for partridge pea, 3 for wild strawberries. These are kind of the generalists, or sort of the weedy native species. So, you know, while it's certainly important to conserve them, we don't really have to go to any great lengths to do that. They're common, even though they're native, they're common on roadsides and fallow fields. They're common about the landscape. And so we don't really have to place a lot of significance on our trying to conserve them. They're pretty much all over. Then we move into the next group of species that are considered kind of the matrix species. These are the ones that make up the bulk of the biomass. And so you have ones like wild bergamot is a 4, and butterfly weed's a 5, Indian paintbrush is a 6. So, so these are the ones that really constitute the bulk of the community we see when we go out on a prairie. But then we come to what are known as the conservative species. These are the species which are not very tolerant of disturbance. And so when we find these conservative species, that starts to tell us, give us a lot more clues that we're looking at a significant part of our natural landscape, a remnant that survived without the major disturbances that have removed them from most of the areas. So among the conservatives, we have sevens like prairie trout lily and rough wild lettuce and Culver's root. Eights are things like early ladies tresses orchids, ragged orchids, and fringed poppy mallow. There's nines like downy gentian, royal catchfly, and bunch flower. And 10 species such as the prairie grass pink orchid, blue hearts, and prairie violets. So these are the species, when we find these conservative species, they start to show us that we really have a pretty intact remnant example of that pre-settlement part of our landscape, the natural community. So you might say that we could use this as a tool for kind of gauging the irreplaceability. The higher the C value or CC value, the higher the quality, the greater the conservative significance or the irreplaceability of a system. If a prairie is plowed, it would be very easy to get wild strawberries or black-eyed Susans back there. It would not be easy, if even possible, to get many of these conservative species. So these give us a good way to judge the integrity of the community and the irreplaceability. So to see how this works, on the photo I took Gem Prairie a few years ago. I was really amazed when I looked through it in detail, could zoom in and find a lot of species out here. So we could kind of use this as an example of a plot for a moment and look at the species that show up in just this one photo. So there's things like black-eyed Susans and yarrow. Those both have a ranking of 1. There's flowering spurge, that's a 3. Daisy fleabane is a 3. And so is Ohio spiderwort, a 3. A 4 is a perennial foxtail. 5 are dragon plant. Slender lespedeza is also a 5. We have several different 6s. Ash ear, downy sunflower, sensitive briar, and round-headed bush clover. And so is prairie blazing star. And then we kind of start the conservatives. There's finger coreopsis, a 7. Pale purple coneflower, also a 7. White prairie clover up here is an 8. As is rattlesnake master and lead plant. So this is all the species I could identify in just this one photo. And so if we use this kind of as our plot, you can see the scores here. So we have a number of different plants here, but the way we work is to range from looking at the entire down to just a single like quadrat or sampling plot is usually to take the average of what you find. So in this case, we have a total score of, you might say, of 87 divided by the 17 species, and we would get an average or mean coefficient of conservatism of 5.1, which actually is a very good score, and it's not out of line of what we find oftentimes in some of our higher quality prairies. So this gives us a way to kind of look at the overall quality of the site. It doesn't matter quite as much about size since we're taking the average. So it can be looked at for like the entire prairie, but it can also be used at smaller plot and quadrant levels for more detailed work. Now, over time, it's been discovered that usually when you have the mean score like this of about 4, you usually have a pretty good indication that that site has quite a good floristic quality or integrity. And is generally considered to be a pretty good example of a natural community. It could be just a little bit below 4, like 3.8 or 3.9, and then certainly it'll range up from there. But generally, when you get a score of about 4, you generally start getting a pretty good example of an intact prairie community. Now you can see, even with looking at the floristics of it, even in a high quality prairie, it's not all high scores. All the other species belong there too. There are the generalists, some of the generalists that are out there, and you of course get a good variety of the matrix species, but you do get a number of these conservative elements there to start to tell us that it's a good system. Now, over the years for the Prairie Foundation prairies, started back in '99 and 2000 when Doug Ladd and Beth Churchwell did an ecological assessment of our prairies. And more recently, we've been having more detailed floristic inventories done by the Institute of Botanical Training. And we also keep our own lists of what we find in the prairies. The more detailed ecological samplings that have been done by the Institute of Botanical Training in the last few years, here's a list of the prairies, and for each of the plots, each plot consists of 25 quadrants, and you can see that basically the plot values are all above 4. And on the right-hand side is how many of those plots were put into prairie, but you can see, you know, the plots are getting us a good representation of what's there. And by these coefficients of conservative scores, you can see that they're hanging in there very good with a lot of good species there, indicating the quality of the natural community. Here you can see a list of all of our prairies, the list of native species, that's overall for the prairie. The CC7 plus is the number of those conservative species in that prairie, which I don't think there's any kind of sort of evaluation of, but I think it's really encouraging when you see even some of the smaller prairies have well over 20 of the conservative species, running all the way up to, in some cases, about or more, that a lot of those good conservative species are out in the prairies, indicating their community quality. And the mean native score, which I mentioned before, goes from just a couple that are just barely under 4, all the way up through the 4s to almost 5. So really, really rich sites. And so our prairies, all the ones with good remnant prairies, the number of species ranges from 174 to 351. The number of conservative species, 23 to 53. And the mean native coefficient of conservatism from 3.8 to right at 5. Now, just a couple examples of a few sort of interesting sites and how this kind of relates. One of which is La Petite Gem Prairie. Only 37 acres. It's bordered by a little bit of prairie that's got some houses on it, but for the most part, it's a pretty small, fairly isolated remnant prairie that the Prairie Foundation's had since 1974. Up until about 2016, when we held a BioBlitz there were 284 native species known, which is a pretty incredible number of species in a pretty small remnant prairie. But just on that one day for the BioBlitz, we added 15 new species to the list. And this is a site we've had for quite a while. It's been looked at a number of times. And yet that one day we added 15 new species. Now, more importantly, I think, is that 14 of them were native. And the average coefficient of conservatism of those additions is 5.4, meaning we weren't finding a bunch of native species or a bunch of exotics that had invaded the prairie. These are high quality native plants generally that we were finding and adding to the system. And the Institute of Botanical Training also did some of their sampling there and found that in just a 1/4 meter quadrant, just about 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet, they found 38 species, the most they had ever found for a site. And again, these weren't a lot of just weedy things crammed in, because those 38 species in that one quadrant had an average, a mean conservation coefficient of almost 5. So they were finding lots of really good indicating species right there in that one tiny little plot. And overall, the 3 plots they did, you can see down below that they went from 4.2 to 4.6 on each one of those plots. Pennsylvania Prairie, another prairie we've had for quite a while, one of our oldest prairies, 160 acres. And actually, it was first sampled in 2015 with scores, the plot scores going from 4.6 to 4.7. And one quadrant there had 36 species, which was the highest the Institute of Botanical Training had ever seen in Missouri until they went to La Petite Gem the next year. But then a couple of years, they came back, did another quadrant in Pennsylvania Prairie in 2018. And you can see in one quadrant there, they kind of blew the system away with 46 species, which, as far as they can tell from an article on published reports of this kind of sampling for that size quadrant, was the highest number of species ever recorded anywhere on Earth. Coyne Prairie, just a short distance away from Pennsylvania Prairie. It was acquired much more recently, so it had been hayed and at until more recently. So when it was first sampled in 2012, 2 of the plots had coefficients of conservatism of 4.15 and 3.9. But this was one that, since it was sampled early in 17 and 18, the Institute of Botanical Training was able to resample them. And this is, we think, a lot of good news about our management of it, that the coefficient of conservatism on these 2 quadrants, on these 2 plots, actually went up a pretty significant amount. So in just a few years of, we think, more proper natural community management of this prairie, we've actually seen an improvement in the floristic integrity of it. So that's a really good sign. There was one plot that didn't go up like this, but it was one that happened to have fallen several years in kind of a fire line and travel way. So that wasn't really comparable, but the 2 that were comparable, there were some very nice increases seen in that. In Linden's Prairie, prairie known for royal catchfly, it has 4 plots established in it, which are very high. And you can see one of those plots, just the water meters, the plot itself had an average coefficient of conservatism of 5.0. I think the highest that they got in any of their sampling. And so for the prairie as a whole, the species total isn't quite as high as some of the others, but this average ranking is very good. And then just a couple of our newer, smaller sites, because oftentimes people had kind of avoided in recent years sampling smaller, or acquiring and protecting smaller sites, simply because they didn't think they would last as long, or they just weren't going to support certain things. And so basically smaller prairie remnants were being passed over for larger landscapes. Even if the was much lower quality land, these smaller high quality little prairie remnants were being passed over. This brown prairie in Newton County, only 19 acres. And yet it's got almost 200 species, but look at that, 43 conservative species, and a mean average coefficient of conservatism of over 4.8, just on this one little site, which has been an isolated little prairie remnant for decades and decades. And yet it's holding a lot of this floristic resource and conservation significance very well. And Snowball Hill, over near Kansas City, only 22-acre prairie. Again, it's been a very small little isolated remnant for a long time. Back in 1987, it was visited a few times and listed 87 species with a very high conservation coefficient average, and 22 species over 7. Since we had it in like 15 to 17, we sampled it more times, so we're going to find more species, but we found basically all of those plus another 126 species. But overall, what's amazing is with those native species, you can see 49 conservative species, and the mean coefficient of conservatism as we added more species actually went up to right at 5. Amazing for a prairie that oftentimes was just overlooked because it was a fairly small little remnant. So another thing we can look at for conservation significance is species of conservation concern. Here's a list of all the plant species of conservation concern on MPF prairies. The couple in red used to be state listed, but they're not anymore, but at one time they were. Here's all the species of conservation concern listed prairie by prairie, with a few additional prairies now to add. When we move into the fauna though, actually when we look at fauna, what we're going to find out is that it's really the little things that kind of rule. This was done, these species estimates were from a little bit north of here, like up in the Chicago region, but it was estimated species about 130 typically found in prairies, plant species about 10 times more, about 1,300 plant species. But then when you look at insects, it's estimated about 13,000 prairie species of insects. But what is especially interesting is there's not one simple rule like the coefficients of conservatism for Missouri flora, but there are a number of entomologists that do rate species as being prairie specialists, pollen specialists on prairie forbs, conservative species, remnant dependent species. All these kind of relate to the same thing as the conservative species for plants. Area, Ron Panzer and others have estimated about 20% of the prairie insects in that region are remnant dependent. They need those little remnants left, and size doesn't really matter very much to them as long as it is a remnant natural community. And that about 70% of the remnant dependent species are pretty rare. In another study in Wisconsin, looking at just a partial list of the prairie insects, it was almost 500 species are these specialists, and there's probably several times more than that. Again, on our prairies, if we look at examples of some of these specialists, example is Regal fritillary, a state-listed butterfly that the caterpillar only feeds on prairie violets that are pretty conservative. Another example is the rattlesnake master stem borer moth, only recently found in Missouri, and it requires completely on rattlesnake master and rarely rattlesnake master growing in reconstructed sites, almost entirely on rattlesnake master growing in a native prairie. There are the bees that are oftentimes specialists, specializing in pollen from oftentimes some of our more conservative prairie forbs, which then is going to limit the distribution of the bee. So just as an example, in MPF prairie, regal fritillaries are known for many different prairies. There's a little moth that's just been found in Carver and Brown prairies within the last couple years. We'll just call it D. reliqua. And so it's conservation concern. And prairie mole cricket found at several of our prairies. So those are rare species, but then there's a number of others that have a lot of significance La Petite Gem, only the second record in Missouri. Again, the rattlesnake master stem boar at 3 of our prairies, golden byssus, remnant dependent species on a couple prairies, and another one from Linden's Prairie. And on bees, Mike Arduzer reported bees at several of our prairies. And again, you can see in the column down below that he does rate different ones as being native pollen specialists and conservative species. So again, these would be the ones with the greatest conservation significance because they would be the most irreplaceable on the landscape. For vertebrates like birds, there's not really quite the same way to rank them. And most of the vertebrates are more the grassland species, not restricted to a prairie natural community, but depending on a grassland structure of a native prairie, are also benefiting a lot from things like CRP plantings and other habitat improvement plantings that give you the structure of a native grassland. So while they're not ranked the same way as conservative plants are, the Missouri River Bird Observatory has given them a rating, and this rating is based more on their population dynamics. What is their current population levels? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Which generally are decreasing for grassland birds. And so they're ranked by those criteria. And so you can see they have a regular ranking system for these birds on judging by their sort of population numbers and trend lines. And so while birds do oftentimes prefer larger sites, you can see that this is just a list of some of our Prairie Foundation prairies, and the main grassland, the main obligate grassland birds, they're ranking across the top, and that you can see most of our prairies being managed for the floristic integrity and the whole natural community, but the birds are usually doing quite well there. We have a few other target organisms, amphibians like the northern crayfish frog, which is actually state listed, and I believe the tiger salamander is also, and the smallmouth salamander. There are some reptiles that made conservation targets because of their use of native prairie, so ornate box turtles and bull snakes. And so if we go to kind of sum it up, all areas are going to have some conservation significance. Any area that's kind of left alone a little bit, so it does provide some habitat for wildlife and some of the other values, is going to have conservation significance. But especially when we're dealing with limited budgets and remnants being destroyed all the time, how can we look at what is the increasing conservation significance? So this is kind of the way we look at it. If you have the ecological integrity that is very important. It's some of the irreplaceability. You have the irreplaceability of the rare flora and fauna you find there. You have undisturbed soils, because if the soils were disturbed, you wouldn't have the conservative flora. And so they all kind of mesh together very well. You have prairie specialists, some of the different kinds of insects in that actually require a prairie community. But then you also have the grassland target species. So you have the different birds and the herps and the other target species that are not totally restricted to it, but they're a very, very important role, have a very important role in the prairie community. And then on top of all that, then you have the more general grassland species that you will find there too. And if you're fortunate, maybe there'll even be a prairie stream, which are very rare communities nowadays in Missouri. Maybe even rarer than the prairie itself is a prairie stream. So all these things are things we look for adding conservation significance to a site that we think is important to protect. So with a remnant prairie, you get a diversity of plants with the higher C values. That indicates pretty undisturbed soils. Oftentimes you'll have rare species. You'll also have those conservative species. These are the most irreplaceable, Leopold's cogs and wheels. You maintain the complexity of all these interactions of species in the ecosystem, and it protects our natural history and the beauty of this this native diversity. And the final piece, which won't go into it all today, but the final piece is wise and careful management, because we know that prairies have to be managed, but it has to be done in a very careful manner and done very thoughtfully in order to try and protect and maintain all these different important natural elements from here on. And so with that, the presentation is over and we can try and take any questions. Okay.
Oh, Bruce, this is Carol David. Everyone, this is Carol David. I'm the executive director of the Prairie Foundation. Bruce, can you hear me?
Yep.
There are some questions, some really good questions, and let me go through here. We don't have a whole lot of time, so you may not be able to spend too much time on each question, but maybe we can point people to more resources. There's a question from Emily about how do these richness numbers, when we're looking at the plants and the CC values of remnant prairies, compare to reconstructed prairies?
It's a little bit different. There have been some studies kind of starting to be done to look at that. And overall, well, I know especially of one place in mid-Missouri where there was actually the same kind of data was used and analyzed, and it generally came up, especially for reconstructions, and these are pretty high quality reconstructions. And if they're especially under about 10 or 12 years old, there's a pretty marked difference between the two. Some of the older ones, if you just go by that system, they can start to rank fairly similar in just the floristic conditions. But you have to remember, in many cases, you're deliberately planting the higher quality species, a higher CC species in there. So it is going to be a little misleading because you're directly putting them in there. So again, over time, it will give you a reconstruction which looks much nicer. And so certainly that's worthwhile to do. But you're also probably not going to have some of the other benefits, because while you can get, some of the plants come back, obviously the soils have been disturbed, they've been plowed. So you're starting from scratch with soils that don't have, the same things in them, and we don't know what it could ever take to get those back. And the effects of other things, again, it's hard to know. I have heard people say, some of the entomologists, that even when you find some of these native plants, some of the conservative native plants in plantings, but they don't necessarily seem to have insects that you find on those same species in a native prairie. Is there something in the soil that is making a difference? It's some life cycle for the insect, and that we don't know. So floristically, if you spend a lot of time putting in the right species and work at it enough, you can get something that floristically will start to resemble a native prairie, but we still think it's probably lacking in a lot of ways that we just don't know.
Thanks, Bruce. Got a few more questions here. There's a question here, does NPF's interest extend to glades, or is it limited to prairies? And I'll just answer that. Yes, we are interested in all native grassland types. So that would be prairies, glades, savannas, even open woodlands. We do own a glade that actually occurs within our Schuette Prairie. We don't own any glades that are by themselves. We definitely would love to protect glades, and we certainly advocate for the protection and restoration and stewardship of all native grassland types. Another question is, how, thanking us for recording this. We'll be able to find the recording later. I think it will be available on Facebook, and we will, if it's available anywhere else, we'll put that information on Facebook for you. I had a couple of questions, and I will say that we're almost to 4:45, but I believe we can keep going. So if you want to stay on and hear the rest of the answers to the questions, I don't think we'll be cut off. If we are, we'll know. But there's a couple questions about using glyphosate or Roundup for prairie reconstructions. So is it possible to transform, say a fescue field into a prairie planting without using herbicides? So maybe you could answer, and what do we recommend doing? If you could address that, Bruce.
Yeah, it would be very difficult to do it without using herbicides at all, just because in today's landscape, the exotic weeds and even some of the native weeds are just so ubiquitous on the landscape that there's just not really much way to let the prairie plants get established without being overrun by the weedy or the exotics. On a small scale, if you're just doing like small little plots, by being able to pull or things like that, you might be able to. But on any kind of scale at all, I just don't see how it's feasible to do it without them. Now, of course, if you're starting a planting by, say, on tilled ground, on ground that's been tilled, and probably generally it will have had some herbicides applied, but having been tilled, say, for a number of years, that will cut down on the amount of the weeds or exotics that are already there when you start planting. So it probably would not be, the same amount of use if you're trying to do something without tilling it first and just have a planting within some on ground with an existing ground cover that you're just trying to kill, then that obviously requires even a lot more herbicide.
Thanks, Bruce. I think it is also good to note that, if we want to increase biodiversity, herbicide is an important tool to use, and it can be used judiciously and wisely. A couple questions on how can people get a list of plants that show the CC values of each plant?
Let's see. I can't remember if on our website how we have that listed, because don't we have the floristic values for a lot of, we've got most of our prairies, I think we've got a plant list on the website, don't we?
Well, we definitely have the floristic assessments that we've had done. So say, for example, one for La Petite Gem Prairie, that's going to be on the La Petite Gem webpage. And
right.
There will be CC values in there.
Right, and so actually, if you look at a few of those, you could probably get it from the majority of species. The article itself, you could probably get, I think at least a few years ago, people were able to just do like a Google search for the ecological checklist of the Missouri flora for floristic quality assessment by Doug Ladd and Justin Thomas. It was 2015. It was published in Phytoneuron. And so I think people were able to get it and download it that way. Otherwise, presumably, I mean, we could even probably email a copy to somebody if we have their email address. I know I've done it to a few individuals.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we'll make a point of trying to make this more readily apparent and findable on our, easy to find on our website, but do send us a private message through Facebook if you're not finding it. We have a question from Dawn. Are our prairies able to be visited by those of us not in this field of study? My fear is disturbing the ecosystem by walking in it. Great question. All of the Missouri Prairie Foundation prairies are open to the public for nature study and hiking, and you will not hurt them by walking on them. We encourage you to visit Missouri Prairie Foundation Prairies on foot for bird watching, nature study, hiking. Just during the pandemic, we ask that you practice social distancing when you do that. There are also public prairies owned by the Conservation Department and other groups, and those of course are public and they're available to visit as well. Another question, do we use non-plowed prairie soil to inoculate another prairie? And then there's a related question, what are actinobacteria? So maybe you could talk about the soil microbes, and do we ever do anything, are we moving, or do we do any inoculation?
We haven't done that yet. I have heard of people talking about it. I don't know that I have ever heard anything from a scientific standpoint about if it's been shown to really make too much difference or not. So it is something we've heard about. We have not done it ourselves. And again, I haven't heard any details on how successful it is, or what the different ramifications are. I mean, would you have, if there's certain parameters of what kind of soil and where you would get it from, and all those sorts of things. And especially because there's so little known about the organisms itself. We're just kind of starting to know that they exist in there, but, still totally blinded as far as, what they actually are and their ecology and all those sorts of things. And as far as what the actinobacteria is, I'm sorry, I have no idea.
I'll just add too, there are folks who don't use prairie soil to inoculate another prairie, but they use it to inoculate soil in a greenhouse in which they are growing other prairie plants. There's an article about prairie mycorrhizal fungi in the Missouri Prairie Journal. I will post a link to it on Facebook, either connected to this recording, or it'll just be, I'll try to make it obvious where it is. Let's see, somebody had a question about the method about Tucker Prairie, asked for us to talk about Tucker Prairie. I'll say quickly, Tucker Prairie is a national natural landmark. It's owned by the University of Missouri. It is managed by the Missouri Department of Conservation. It's a hardpan prairie, so it's a different community type. And if you want to learn more about community types, all the different kinds of prairie communities, tune into our webinar next week. Then Mike Leahy will talk about that. But that's just a little bit about Tucker Prairie, and Bruce may want to add more.
I'm not real familiar with Tucker Prairie. I know it's, well, it was a site of a lot of research when it was first acquired. Can't remember if it was the 50s or the 60s, but anyway, it was a fairly early site that was acquired in Missouri, and it was used extensively for research by University of Missouri at Columbia. They used it as a research site and published many, many articles on studies that were done there. It is all a native prairie. I think it had been fairly beat up before it was acquired, but it had never been plowed. And then since it's had a long time, it's really come back well. So it's a very nice example of that kind of prairie community that has been very important from what's been learned about prairies through all the different research at that site.
Thank you. I just looked up, it was acquired by the university in 1957. Let's see, there was another question about the methodology. Early on in your presentation, Bruce, you were talking about the methodology of on the plot selection. It seems to me that diversity could vary greatly across a site. I think you did explain it, Bruce, but you might want to just go over it again. I was explaining that to get to the CC value of a whole site, you would take an average of the CC values of the plots analyzed. Is that correct, Bruce?
Yeah, well, as far as the plots that were done by the Institute of Botanical Training, what they would generally do is pick out an area for one of their plots that was all fairly similar. So instead of like, say, including a drainage with a swale that would be richer and have would just add a number of species, they would stick to what was basically the same like community type, the same type of area. So the one plot would be in an area that would be reasonably uniform. And then it was laid out in a grid pattern, like 5 rows with 5 quadrants in each row in that. But those were done to try to eliminate the idea that, well, you just have more diversity over on this side of the plot because it's kind of in a wetter area or a drier area. So those were done to try and keep each plot, the quadrants in that plot would be fairly uniform. But then there might be like one plot on say a little bit moister side than another plot would be. But the plots themselves were designed to kind of be, fairly similar. Now, when we just do the species list, the kind of overall list for the prairie, that would include all the, all the plants that are out there from all the different community types and that.
Okay, great. There was another question about, again, when you were talking about the CC values of plants, would this apply to Eastern Kansas prairies as well? And I replied, the coefficient of conservatism methodology, it would really apply to all natural systems, wouldn't it? I mean, but they would be unique to each, a tropical rainforest, it would be unique to those plants, and Arctic tundra would be, but with Eastern Kansas, of course, a lot of the prairies, the prairie species there are the same as what we have here.
Yeah, it would be probably similar, but ideally it would be tailored a little bit to Kansas, because as you get out in Kansas, even the areas that are tallgrass prairie, but they do get less rainfall, they're going to be somewhat drier than Missouri prairies. And so it would probably be similar, but it's best if the coefficients of conservatism, the actual ranking scores, are suited for like that particular state or even that particular region. There's a lot of states that have sort of developed a similar system, but in each of the states it'll be different. When it was first developed far up around the Chicago area and prairies up there in northeastern Illinois, the rankings we have in Missouri are different than that. They're going to be, generally pretty similar, but some things, because of their range or just their tolerance for moisture or whatever in different parts of their range, can vary. So yeah, it would probably be something you could kind of use, but it would be better, say for Kansas, if the botanists and ecologists in Kansas would kind of alter the system or tweak it a little bit for their particular conditions.
Okay, thank you. I believe that are all the questions. Let me just pan through here to make sure I haven't missed any. Felicia might text me if I've missed any or jump in, but I believe you answered all of the questions. Very good. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. If you are not familiar with the Missouri Prairie Foundation, we welcome you to follow us on Facebook and look at our website and all of the resources that we have, including back issues of the Missouri Prairie Journal, which has lots of great articles in it. So anything else you want to say, Bruce, before we sign off?
I just thank everybody for tuning in. Sorry, it got a little bit of a rough start, but like I say, this is our first time for doing it. Except for that, thank you for tuning in, and hope this was beneficial to you.
just typing out a question to someone, to Mark. I don't, Felicia, are the Q&A gonna go away? He was asking me a question about MPF budget. I hope I can still answer him.
Yeah, go ahead.
Bruce, that was wonderful. We got lots of nice comments. People who've been members for a long time, people who are just tuning in. They were fascinated. Just was super, Bruce. Thank you so much.
Well, that was great to have the opportunity.
Just a note, we have 3 more presentations in this Prairie webinar series. They will be the next 3 Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Mike Leahy is speaking next week on natural communities, different communities. And Sarah Kendrick is speaking the week after about the bird plan for Missouri. And Steve Klubine will be speaking the following week on the 27th about invasive plant management in livestock fields. So please go to our website and register for those if you're interested.
Okay, I think I've signed off to everybody. Oh, 501. There's a few, anyway, just if you want more information, do go to our website, and you can send us a private message on Facebook, or our number, if you want to call us, is 888-843-6739, 888-843-6739. All right, I think I'm going to sign off, Felicia.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm going to end it now.